"Hands up, old man!" The scream cut through the air like a blade, causing the city to stop for an instant. The sunset turned the street gold, and long shadows stretched across the sidewalk as the boy, perhaps 16 years old, walked forward with a shaking hand, holding a rusty gun. He could barely keep the barrel pointed steady, but his eyes were filled with despair. In front of him, with a faded cap and worn jacket, a war veteran just stared at the boy with a calm that seemed to defy time itself. The elderly man's cane fell, making a sharp crack echo on the hot asphalt. The gentle movement with which his fingers released the grip seemed more like a deliberate choice than an act of fear. Cars passed without stopping. Some people glanced out the window, only to look away immediately, pretending not to see. After all, who nowadays really stops to honor an old soldier who, one day, carried the weight of freedom on his shoulders? Have you ever wondered how you would react if you were faced with danger? Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now could change the way you view true strength. The boy, sweating coldly, swallowed hard. He ordered the old man to hand over everything: watch, wallet, even his worn cap that still bore the marks of distant battles. But the veteran didn't move a muscle. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just stood there, with the straight posture of someone who has faced things much worse than the arrogance of a lost youth. It was as if the entire battlefield was before him again, but now not with gunfire and bombs, but with the silent choice between fear and mercy. The wind whispered through the trees, and in the distance, an American flag fluttered lazily on the porch of a forgotten house. Every little detail of that scene seemed to scream something that many had already forgotten. Respect, honor, freedom. Words that, for some, still have weight. For others, they became just empty phrases in history books. The boy, nervous, took a step forward. The gun shook. Any false move could turn that moment into tragedy. But the old man, with eyes as serene as the sea after a storm, just spoke, with a firm, low voice, filled with something that few today recognize: discipline over violence. "Son," he said, "this is not how you prove your strength." Those words pierced the boy like an invisible arrow. There, at that forgotten intersection, two destinies faced each other. Not through brute force, but through the internal struggle of those who needed to choose between the shadow and the light. The veteran, with his silent strength, didn't need to lift a finger to be heard, and that boy, for the first time in a long time, hesitated. You would feel your heart racing if you were there, because it was impossible not to notice. Something much bigger than a simple robbery was happening. What would the boy do next? What could that old man's past reveal in that decisive moment? Is there still room for honor, sacrifice, and faith in a world that seems to have forgotten its true heroes? Now, I want to take you even deeper into this story, because what happens next is something you will never forget. The boy lowered his head for a brief second, as if those words weighed more than the gun in his hands. The world seemed to compress around them. The heat from the asphalt rose in waves. The smell of dry earth, distant smoke, and the muffled sound of the footsteps of those who didn't dare approach created a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. It was like being in a slow nightmare, where every second was harder to pass by. The veteran didn't back down, not an inch. His knees hurt. His back begged him to sit down. But he remained there, firm as an ancient tree punished by time and war, carrying on his body the invisible scars that only a true hero can carry. Every line on his face told a story that the modern world had forgotten. Every breath was a victory against surrender. The boy raised the gun again, but his hands were shaking so much he could barely aim. His eyes flashed for a moment. Not with anger, but with fear. Of regret. Perhaps recognition. The old man saw this. He saw it because he had seen it before, so many times, in places so far away that only the smell of sand and the taste of fear could describe it. And it was at that moment that the veteran took a step forward. Small, almost imperceptible, but carrying the courage of someone who has already faced the worst side of humanity and still chose to stand tall. His gaze, firm, passed through the boy not as an accusation, but as a silent invitation to be more than his circumstances. If you've ever felt a tightness in your chest just imagining a scene like this, I invite you to share it here in the comments. What has touched you the most so far? What would you do if you were there, watching it all happen? Your opinion is very important. It is what transforms this space into a true community of respect and hope. And if this story has already moved you in some way, take the opportunity to like the video. This really helps this message reach those who need to hear something like this today. And of course, if you want to continue following stories that honor our true heroes, subscribe to the channel. Your presence here makes all the difference so that this flame never goes out. The boy blinked, confused, as if he was finally seeing the veteran for who he really was. Not a frail old man on the sidewalk, but a living monument of sacrifice, faith, and discipline. The wind blew harder, kicking up dust and making the flag in the distance snap like a whisper of history. The weapon fell to the ground with a hollow, heavy sound, full of meaning. And at that moment, when everything seemed to finally soften around them, something even deeper began to emerge from that scene. Something that no one expected to witness in that forgotten late afternoon. The boy advanced, spitting insults that echoed hollowly in the almost deserted street, desperately trying to disguise the fear that consumed his chest. His hands were shaking. His gaze was fleeting. His teeth were clenched in a futile effort to appear strong. Every word that came out of his mouth was a pathetic attempt to erase the insecurity that was eating him up inside. "Pass it all, useless old man!" he shouted, pushing the barrel of the gun against the elderly man's chest, as if that could erase the decades of sacrifice written in the deep wrinkles of that face. Some passers-by stopped briefly to observe the scene. A woman covered her little daughter's eyes and quickened her pace. A man in his car just locked the doors, looking away. The indifference was as cutting as the act of violence itself. On that dirty sidewalk, the veteran was all alone, surrounded not just by danger, but by an abandonment that hurt more than any weapon could. The old man's posture, however, remained upright. The spine, although punished by the years, did not give way. He was like a living statue of forgotten honor, rooted in the hidden truth of his own history. His eyes, tired but firm, looked at the boy not with fear, nor anger, but with a strange compassion that disarmed any attempt at hatred. It was as if he were saying, without words, "I've seen hell, son, and you're not it." The boy, unable to sustain that look, kicked the veteran's cane away. The cane rolled down the street, hitting the gutter with a sad metallic sound, like a lament for everything that had already been lost. Pain shot through the elderly man's tired body, but he did not falter. Not a grimace, not a sigh. Just more silence. Silent strength. Because for him, physical pain was just another shadow among so many others. The crowd, growing larger, watched as if watching an inevitable accident. Some with wide eyes, others with cell phones in hand, ready to record the misfortune, but never to avoid it. The feeling of injustice hung heavy in the air like thick smoke. That man, who had once worn his uniform with pride, was now treated like dirt under the indifferent gaze of the society he had sworn to protect. The boy demanded the watch. A simple object, even cheap. But for the old man, every scratch on that metal was an engraved memory of brothers who never returned, of battles fought under skies that cried death. He took off his watch with firm fingers, as if handing over a sacred relic. When the boy ripped the faded cap off the old man's head, exposing his fine white hair to the cold wind, something inside the old man shivered. Not out of fear, but out of deep sadness. As if there, in that banal gesture, the last link that linked him to the respect he deserved was being torn. The jacket was the next target. "Take that damn thing off!" shouted the boy, his voice choked with tension. The veteran, with slow and dignified movements, unbuttoned the old jacket that carried not just worn fabric, but the weight of a lifetime of battles, losses, and sacrifices. When the jacket fell to the floor, raising a small cloud of dust, it seemed as if that man's entire history was trampled along with it. But even stripped of everything he was visibly carrying, he remained intact. Because her true value was rooted in something no one could steal: courage, faith, and purpose. The boy, panting, aimed the gun harder, as if trying to break the invisible wall that separated his fury from the veteran's serenity. But it was useless. The gun shook. The eyes were watering, and for the first time, the young man seemed smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Because there was no triumph in humiliating a man who had already won the greatest battles a human being could face. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because what was about to happen at that forgotten intersection would change not only the fates of those two men, but of everyone who witnessed the silent and brutal scene before them. While the boy hesitated, something new appeared in the air. An invisible weight, a call that few could hear, but that vibrated in the souls of those who still believed in the power of transformation. It was as if the streets, the houses, the very ground beneath their feet were crying out for a new decision, for a new direction. The flag in the distance, swinging tiredly on the rusty pole, seemed to observe everything with an old and wise look. The veteran, without saying a word, just took a deep breath. His eyes, marked by the wars of the past, now seemed to want to reach the heart of that lost young man. Not to condemn you, but to remind you that there is always a way back, even after wrong choices. The transformation was there, just a few steps away. Just reach out, just make a different choice. And in that moment, amidst the suffocating tension, something began to change. If this moment touched you in any way, write in the comments. True strength comes from the soul. I really want to read your opinion about everything we are experiencing together here. For the first time, he felt shame. It was no longer the weapon in his hands that weighed him down. It was that old man's gaze, steady, silent, filled with something the boy had never experienced before: true compassion. It was as if that man, even under the humiliation, still managed to see something good inside him. And that hurt. It hurt more than any physical punishment could. Sweat ran down the boy's face in rivers. His hands were so wet he could barely keep the pistol aimed. Every beat of his heart sounded like a drum out of tune inside his head. Each breath was an almost unbearable effort. The weight of the moment crushed her thin shoulders. He felt like he could fall at any moment, like a fragile structure that was only kept upright by sheer desperation. The old veteran, without another word, remained motionless, as if his simple presence was a living reminder of all the wrong choices that boy had made to get there. The suffering in the boy's chest increased every second, like a guilt that grew from the inside out, wanting to explode. Every distant laugh from those watching from afar was a blade ripping through his invisible skin. Every indifferent look from the crowd was another brick in the wall of his own shame. The boy tried to harden his face, tried to convince himself that he was still in control, that he could still end this his way. But it was too late. The old man had already won. Not by force, not because of the threat, but for something infinitely stronger. The hidden truth that said mercy is the most powerful act of all. The weapon weighed tons now. The boy struggled to keep it up, but it was like trying to hold on to his own past. And the past, cruel as always, was beginning to crush him. He blinked, trying to ward off the tears that were rising against his will. His throat closed in a knot, and for the first time in a long time, he felt small. So small that it felt like the whole world could swallow him. The legs began to fail. His body was showing signs that it couldn't take much more. Shame, fear, anger, and now regret formed an acidic mixture inside him. The whole scene seemed like a merciless punishment, as if all the mistakes he had made were there, materialized in the figure of that old man standing before him. The veteran then took it a step further. A single step, dragging the worn boot across the hot concrete. It was a slow movement, but full of meaning. It wasn't a threat. It was a silent invitation to redemption. The boy retreated instinctively, like a wounded animal that doesn't know whether to attack or run away. But there was something in the man's eyes, Something so strong, so absolute, that paralyzed him. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the real transformation was just beginning. Something inside the boy was beginning to crumble, like a house of cards exposed to the wind of truth, like ancient walls slowly being consumed by time and guilt. The boy felt his legs give way. He dropped to his knees on the rough asphalt. The cold, dirty stones tore his thin pants and hurt his knees, but he barely noticed. What really hurt was the soul. He dropped the gun, which fell to the floor with a loud crack. It wasn't just a metal object he abandoned. It was a symbol of the life he was leaving behind at that very moment. The veteran, with enormous effort, also knelt down in front of him. Pain shot through his punished joints, but he paid it no mind. Because there, in that sacred moment, it wasn't about bodies. It was about souls. Without saying a word, the old man extended his hand, not to get the gun, not to dominate the boy, but to raise something that no one else saw: the lost dignity of that young man. The surrounding crowd watched in silence. Even the most cynical, even the most indifferent, seemed to feel the weight of that moment, as if something much bigger than themselves was unfolding before their eyes. The boy, with tears running freely down his dirty face, looked at his outstretched hand, and for the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to truly be seen. Not as a problem, not as a threat, but as a human being. He held out his own hand, hesitantly, and when his fingers touched the veteran's, an invisible current of strength coursed through his body. It was as if all the suffering, all the pain, all the accumulated anger finally found an outlet, and what remained was just the seed of something new, something pure, something good. The old man helped him up, slowly, painfully, but without ever letting go of your hand. A simple gesture, but full of meaning that words could never explain. The weapon was left behind, forgotten on the floor. It was no longer necessary. True power had been chosen, and it was not in weapons, threats, or violence. I had the courage to forgive, in the silent strength of reaching out instead of clenching it into a fist. The sun, which previously seemed immersed in sadness, now dyed the scene with a different golden light, as if the sky itself recognized the greatness of that moment. The transformation, redemption, the real victory. If this part of the story moved you, write in the comments. I believe in transformation. The boy, still on his knees, tried to regain control of his breathing, but it seemed as if the air had become too thick to enter his lungs. Around him, the world began to change, almost imperceptibly at first, like a murmur that slowly spread among those watching. On the bench in the nearby square, an older man stood up, widening his eyes as if recognizing a ghost forgotten by time. The whisper escaped his lips before he could stop himself. "It's him. It can't be." Others began to turn, attracted by the movement, by the words, by the strange sensation of being in front of something much bigger than they could understand at that moment. The name, lost in decades of silence and neglect, ran through the crowd like an invisible thread of electricity. A name that had once been written on medals of honor, then buried in secret reports, hidden from history books, and whispered only in hallways where real men still remembered those who had truly saved lives in the humid jungles and sun-scorched fields of war. The suffering in the old man's chest seemed to increase with each step taken by the approaching crowd. But it wasn't fear. It was the weight of responsibility. It was the pain of someone who never sought recognition, but who now saw their scars exposed as open wounds before eyes that would never fully understand what was sacrificed. His past, which he had carried silently like a cross, was now resurfacing without his permission. The wrinkles on his face were maps of ancient battles, marks of losses that had never been healed. Every step of the crowd toward him made those memories pulse like fresh wounds. He didn't want to see all that again. I didn't want to be the hero again. I had already paid the price, and how expensive it was. The boy, still kneeling, noticed that something was changing in the air. His eyes, now full of tears, followed the gazes around him, And for the first time, he realized that the man before him was not just a tough old man. He was a living legend. The shame that was already consuming him tripled in weight, crushing him inside. It was as if every rude word he had thrown before was a stone now falling on his chest, one after another. The faces that previously looked on with contempt or indifference began to transform. Contempt turned to respect. Indifference turned to guilt. Hardened expressions now trembled, eyes averted, unable to sustain the silent grandeur that rose from the city's cracked sidewalk. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because what would happen in the next few moments was not just a change in perception, but a true journey of transformation. One that would leave invisible marks on everyone who had the courage to stand there, looking at the hidden truth that they had ignored for so long. The veteran looked around with unearthly calm. There was no pride in his stance. There was no vanity in his gaze. He was a soldier, a server, a man who chose to carry the burden of freedom so that others could walk lighter. Even now, faced with other people's shame, faced with the kneeling boy's own shame, he held his head high, not out of arrogance, but because discipline had become a part of him, as vital as breathing. The murmur turned to silence, and then, in the midst of that emotion-charged void, someone took off their hat. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. Soon another followed, and another one. Until dozens of people were there, with hats in their hands or uncovered heads, in a silent and heavy bow, which said more than 1,000 words could ever express. The boy, unable to bear what he was feeling, bowed his head until it touched the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. It was as if the entire weight of his wrong choices were now on his fragile back, pressing him against the harsh and inescapable reality. But it was also the first step towards transformation. The first genuine crack in the armor of hate and pain he had worn for so long. The old veteran, even with the pain punishing every fiber of his body, bent down once again. He placed a trembling hand on the boy's back and murmured something so low that only he could hear. Sacrifice. Freedom. It's all yours too, son. You just have to choose. These words, so simple and so heavy, penetrated deep into the boy's soul. There was no judgment in them, just true. Just the sincere offer of a new life, a new path, a new mindset. The wind blew stronger, as if nature itself was trying to cleanse the air filled with pain and redemption. The American flag, which waved almost forgotten in the distance, now fluttered strong, vibrant, as a silent reminder of everything that had been achieved, and the price that was paid so that this moment could exist. Some people in the crowd began to come forward, not to judge, but to witness, to bow, to acknowledge the silent greatness that was there before them. It wasn't just an old man's story. It was the story of all those who had fought invisible battles, carried silent burdens, chosen discipline over violence, mercy over revenge. The hidden truth of that journey was now exposed for all to see. It wasn't just about a lowered weapon or an averted aggression. It was about something much deeper. It was about the human ability to choose between perpetuating the cycle of pain or breaking it with the invisible force of love and compassion. If this moment touched you, comment, "I believe in the power of compassion." The wind was blowing strong now, as if it wanted to wash away the pain, the guilt, the wrong choices that hung in the thick air of that forgotten street. The American flag, half torn at the ends by time, fluttered firmly on the porch of a nearby house, illuminated by the last golden beams of a tired sun. It was as if she, too, was witnessing that scene, keeping in her threadbare fabric the silent memory of a sacrifice that most had already forgotten. The gun in the boy's hands seemed to have doubled in weight. Sweat ran in thick beads down his forehead, wetting the collar of his cheap, torn shirt. His breathing was short, desperate, his chest rising and falling, as if trying to maintain a last thread of control over a body that no longer responded. Every muscle in his face betrayed the internal battle between the instinct to escape and the repressed desire to just cry and ask for forgiveness. The old man, in brutal contrast, stood like a rock. His eyes, so blue that they seemed to reflect the sky itself, were fixed on the boy, but without a trace of judgment. They were eyes that had seen horrors that no child should know. Eyes that had faced death, betrayal, irreparable loss, and yet had chosen to carry faith, discipline, and hope into each new dawn. His aged body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the story he carried on his tired shoulders. Every wrinkle on his face, every mark on his hands was like an invisible medal won in battles that were not written in books. Silent strength. A force that didn't need to scream to be felt, that didn't need to impose itself to be recognized. People, curious and restless, began to approach. Cell phones in their hands, cameras flashing, as if they wanted to capture a sacred moment without knowing exactly what they were witnessing. But despite the cold lenses pointed at them, no one dared to break the silence. It was as if everyone understood, even without words, that they were facing something much bigger than a simple street confrontation. It was the invisible battle between hatred and redemption, fought deep behind the scenes of the human soul. The boy, pressured by the silent presence of the crowd and the invisible strength of that man in front of him, took a step back. The gun fell from his hands, hitting the asphalt with a dull crack. And in that sound, in that split second, it seemed like all the weight of his wrong life was freed, hitting the ground along with that useless weapon. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what started as a cowardly robbery attempt was about to turn into something that would change the lives of everyone there. It was no longer just the story of a lost boy or a resilient old man. It was the birth of a new truth, of a new awareness about choices, about impact, about the invisible journey that shapes who we decide to be. The veteran approached. His every step seemed to echo like a drum, beating firmly against the chests of everyone present. There was no hurry in his movements. There was no rush in his soul. He knew that great transformations never happen in a flash, but rather in the slow pace of acceptance, of pain faced head-on, of the courage to look inside without running away from what you find. Upon reaching the kneeling boy, the old man bent down, not as a dominator over a defeated one, but like a father facing an injured son. He knelt down, even though his knees screamed in pain, and placed his calloused hand on the boy's trembling shoulder. It was a light touch, almost a whisper. But the strength that came from that gesture was greater than any army. The boy, embarrassed, collapsed. He let the tears flow freely, without any more resistance, without any more masks. He cried not just for what was happening, but for all the times he couldn't find anyone who believed in him, for all the times he fell and only found kicks, for all the days he was treated like dirt, until he convinced himself that that was exactly what he deserved to be. The old man remained there, motionless, enduring the physical pain and emotional pain as only men forged in suffering are capable of doing. His breathing was heavy, but his spirit was firm. He knew the boy needed this moment more than any punishment, more than any moralistic speech could offer. Sometimes true redemption comes not from punishment, but from understanding. The flag, now dyed by the last golden rays of the setting sun, seemed to silently bless the scene. People in the crowd began to lower their heads in respect. Some cried discreetly, others just watched, touched in a way they might not even know how to explain. But everyone felt they were participating in something rare, something pure, something that transcended the ordinary. The boy, sobbing, tried to get up, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The veteran, with infinite patience, helped him. His strong, calloused hands supported the young man's weight as if he were lifting not just a body, but an entire life broken by the harshness of the world. And when the boy finally stood, supported more by hope than physical strength, the veteran smiled. A small, discreet smile, but filled with a light that illuminated even the darkest corners of the soul. If this part of the story moved you, write in the comments. The light always wins. The boy lowered the gun, as if giving up the fight against his own soul. His hands were shaking so much that they felt like they were made of glass about to shatter on the floor. The gun slipped from his sweaty fingers, hit the asphalt, and spun a few times before stopping, motionless, like a forgotten symbol of a wrong decision that, now, he no longer had the courage to carry. Before he could flee, before he could hide within the shame that was already consuming him, the veteran took a step forward. A heavy, painful step, as if every inch covered was robbed of the strength he still had left. But he advanced, not out of arrogance, not out of superiority. He advanced moved by the silent faith of someone who understands that the most difficult battles are not won with weapons, but with mercy. When the calloused hand rested gently on the boy's shoulder, the boy shivered. It was a touch as light as it was firm. Not an arrest, not a threat. It was a gesture that carried decades of stories, of painful choices, of decisions made in the heat of fear, but always guided by something greater: honor. Freedom means knowing when to fight and when to forgive, whispered the veteran, his voice hoarse but full of a power that no scream could match. And it was at that moment that the world around seemed to sigh. Sirens sounded in the distance, cutting through the silence like a late warning. But no one moved. Nobody ran. There was no longer any urgency for punishment. What the crowd wanted, what every soul there cried out for, without even knowing it, was respect, honor, redemption. The police arrived quickly, tires screeching, doors slamming, harsh voices filling the air. Officers jumped out of their cars with guns drawn, ready to control yet another scene of violence, another ordinary day in the long list of urban disasters. But when they saw what was happening there, something in them also wavered. Because there was no blood. There was no chaos. There was only a boy kneeling, sobbing on the asphalt, and an old soldier standing, his firm hand still resting on the young man's shoulder like a beacon in the midst of the storm. The police hesitated. Out of instinct, they still tried to handcuff the boy, lift the fallen weapon, control the situation as they always did. But it was the veteran who stood between them, not with aggression, but with an authority so profound that it hardly needed to be said. Let him go. Teach him, not punish him. The sentence, simple and devastating, hung in the air like a decree. A request? Perhaps. An order? For sure. The officers looked at each other, confused, disconcerted. The manual said one thing. The moment said otherwise. And for once, they decided to listen to what their hearts said. The boy, unable to stand up, only fell further onto his knees. His heavy tears stained the floor beneath him, mixed with dust, sweat, and regret. It was a free, painful cry from someone who understood that they had received a second chance without deserving it. And exactly for that reason, she was even more precious. The crowd, which until then had kept its distance, began to slowly approach. Some took off their caps, others lowered their heads. The respect that filled the air was almost palpable, as if an ancient truth had been awakened on that forgotten street. That real heroes don't wear capes. They carry scars. The veteran remained motionless. His body ached in places no one saw. Every muscle, every joint seemed to burn with fire. But he didn't back down, because in that moment, he wasn't just an old man defending a lost boy. He was a living symbol of what it means to fight, not for pride, but for purpose. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what few people there knew, and which would soon spread like wildfire, was that that old man was not just any stranger. He was a decorated hero, buried by the very history he helped create. His name, previously erased from the books, now began to be whispered among those present as a revealed truth. One of the younger officers recognized the veteran's face. Trembling, he removed his cap and held it to his chest. Others followed the gesture until, within minutes, dozens of heads were bowed in silent respect. Not by orders, not out of obligation, but because at that moment they all knew they were facing something sacred. The silent force that shapes true leaders. The American flag continued to flutter in the background, now reflecting the glow of the sunset as if nature itself was paying homage. The wind raised small clouds of dust around the scene, but no one seemed to want to blink, afraid of missing a second of this silent miracle. The boy finally managed to get up, still trembling, still fragile, but lifted not by the strength of his muscles, but by the strength of a new decision being born within him. He looked at the veteran, his eyes swollen from crying, and mumbled something almost inaudible. "Thank you." The old man just smiled, that small and tired smile, but filled with a light that many spend their entire lives without encountering. If this moment touched you in any way, write in the comments, "I believe in redemption." The old soldier remained still for a few seconds, observing the young man who, just a few minutes ago, represented a threat, but who was now just a human reflection of what pain can do to a soul still in formation. There was immense weariness in his eyes, not the kind of weariness that comes from a long day, but the kind that builds up after a lifetime of carrying invisible burdens. And yet, despite the pain that throbbed in every bone, despite the heavy memories that knocked on the door of his heart, he chose to remain. Because that's what men like him did. Stayed standing when the whole world wanted to collapse. The wind continued to blow, mixing dust with hope in that late afternoon that seemed suspended between the past and the future. And there, in front of so many anonymous faces, he did what he always knew how to do best. He planted a seed of transformation. A seed that perhaps germinated in that boy, perhaps in the eyes that watched silently, or perhaps in the hearts that would only understand what they saw much later. But the important thing was that the seed was there, alive, planted with the silent sacrifice of those who already understood that true power does not come from what you achieve for yourself, but from what you build in others. And that's exactly what makes me ask you, in all sincerity, to leave here in the comments what touched you most about this story. Sometimes sharing how we feel is the most powerful way to keep that flame of honor, discipline, and mercy alive. Your participation here is what transforms this space into a true community. A place where we not only watch stories, but live together the messages they carry. If this story made sense to you, if in some way it brought a new perspective on strength, forgiveness, and purpose, leave a like. This helps this message reach even further and touches more hearts that, like the boys, sometimes just need a small gesture to change everything. And if you feel that this type of content is important, that stories like this still have value in this busy and noisy world, subscribe to the channel here. I want you to be part of this journey with me, because each new video is another way of remembering what really matters on our journey. For those who stayed this far, and I know that only those who carry this same flame within themselves stay until the end, comment below. I choose to walk with honor. I really want to see who are the brave ones who feel this truth pulsating inside their chest. And if you want to continue diving into this universe of real stories, deep lessons, and transformations that start from the inside out, there's a video here that perfectly complements this journey. Click and stay with me there. Because the journey of those who seek true strength never ends.